Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. I'm Ruben Lawrence. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect with PM Square and also one of the partners of the company. So thanks for coming to the presentation today. So today I'm not going to go into really hardcore, intense technical things. It's more a discussion of ideas. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about visualization and just some design principles and things to keep in mind as you're designing things like dashboards and visualizations. So I'm going to talk about that for a little bit, but then I'm also going to talk about creativity in general, and then specifically where technology and creativity meet and how we can kind of partner those two things together in an optimal way that actually serves us really well. Okay, so yes, stop me if you've heard this one before. An executive walks into a room and asks for a dashboard. And we've all experienced this, and typically what happens is, people run around and, well, actually, come on. There we go. So this is what typically happens. So, we have a couple of preliminary meetings with the person or people who have asked for the dashboard. We sort of put together some loosely defined requirements. And I think, Mike, your session before was about requirements gathering. Okay. So we do that, and then the developer goes right into the tool and starts building things. Then inevitably changes are requested. The developer makes the requested changes, and then basically you go back and forth between 4 and 5 until the budget runs out, and then everyone blames the developer. So no one's happy in that situation. So the problem with the traditional approach is it seems sort of like low-hanging fruit in a way. Well, if I just dive into the tool and start building and designing something, well, then I'll start to construct, what my audience wants. It'll start to take shape, and then eventually it'll become what I've been asked to build. But in practice, it just doesn't work that way. So the best way, in my opinion, is to really focus on design. So design. So spend a lot of time on it, which is something that, in my experience, people are hesitant to put a heavy investment into design up front because they kind of feel like, well, we're just sitting around talking, nothing's really getting built. So is there really any value in this? But in my experience, it just comes back to that old saying we've all heard many times before, measure twice, cut once. It's just, in life in general, things are just easier and come together more smoothly if you take that approach. So how I like to approach building something like a dashboard is, we'll have an initial meeting with the person who's requested this, get some ideas, throw some ideas around, discover what kind of KPIs, measures, things like that they want to have on their dashboard. Then I would take those and discuss it with my developers, and we would bounce around some ideas as to what the end user wants, but then ultimately what's possible within the tool. Because there's, we'd all love to have that like pie in the sky, but when it comes down to actually building something, you need to talk to your developer at the beginning to understand what is and is not going to be possible. And sometimes something is possible, but maybe it's prohibitive in the amount of work that requires to complete it. But these are the kind of things that when you consult with your developer early on, they would be able to advise you on this. So once you've done that, I feel it's important to have a lot of review sessions and discussions with your stakeholders, with your end users. And I personally like to use, I use my iPad Pro for like everything now, but I love just sitting down and just hand drawing out a concept. Let's put these KPIs here. Let's put like this chart over here, and let's have some tabs like this. So I like to just sketch these ideas out, present it to my end user, and inevitably what happens is they give me feedback right away. And what's great is I can just go onto my piece of paper or onto my iPad, and I can just erase what I've put in there and draw something new. It takes like 2 minutes. Now, I work primarily in Cognos, and Cognos is awesome, love it. It can do anything, almost anything. But if I've built sort of a concept of a dashboard, something like this, and then I get a request from the end user, okay, can you move this rectangle from here to here? Well, if I'm working on a sketch, it takes like 3 seconds to erase it and another 3 seconds to draw it over here. But if I go into Cognos to do that, I have to delete an object, recreate it, set a bunch of properties, change the position. It's painful. And so you're expending a lot of energy when you try and do your design work in the tool that you don't need to spend. So it's so much easier to have a number of review sessions based off of just some sketches where you've put together a concept and you work collaboratively with your end users. And then ultimately you get a really solid concept that you can then take to your developers. And you're providing your developer really detailed requirements, which is going to help them develop the report quickly and easily. So as I wrote up there, design twice, build once. And even if you follow this process, inevitably after you present the finished product to your end user, they'll have some small adjustments that they'd like to have, but that's totally fine because you've captured the vast majority of the requirements. You've built it according to the spec that they've agreed on up front. And so now you can make some small tweaks and adjustments. It's not a big deal. And then if all goes well, your dashboard's complete and gorgeous and perfect. So I just wanted to show you a sample of a mock-up that I drew. So I don't know if you can all see it clearly, but yeah, so we were working with a client and kind of throwing around some concepts and ideas of what they might want. And so they had an existing dashboard that they wanted to they wanted to move it from another tool into Cognos, but they also wanted to use a lot of the extra and new functionality that Cognos has as compared to their old tool. So I spent a lot of time drawing these sketches, but whenever we met with the customer, they would come back and say, oh, well, what about this? Or can you add this? And it was just really quick and easy to erase and redraw. And I don't think that this approach is limited to dashboards. I was building a Cognos system for a client, and I don't know, how do people in here feel about Visio? Yeah,
sometimes takes more time.
Yeah.
Work out the intricacies rather than hand drawing.
That's exactly right. And I've worked with people who build an architecture diagram in Visio, and it's so painful. And I feel like it's so unnecessary. So I like to just draw an architecture diagram, present it to my client, and have a discussion about it. And if there's any changes, erase, redraw, no big deal, build it out, continue making changes to it. And then only at the end, after everything's pretty much built, then I'll go into Visio and I will suffer through Visio and build out the final diagram. Yeah, and this is just highlighting, because I do feel this is important. It's really important if you take away one thing. Invest the time and energy into doing your design up front. It is so worth it, and it will pay you dividends that you didn't even realize you could get. So someone whose books and courses I absolutely love are Stephen Few. Is anyone in here familiar with Stephen Few? Yeah? I think another person who kind of works in this space is Edward Tufte. But both of these gentlemen are visualization and kind of data presentation experts. So I took a course from Stephen Few a few years ago about visualization. And his books, his concepts really make you think about data in a different way, in ways that you just wouldn't naturally think of. And so I find myself, since taking his course, whenever I look at a graph or a chart, I'm kind of like critiquing it, like, oh, well, does this really make the most sense to, design this data visualization in this way? So these principles here, there's 13 of them. I call them the bad 13, and they're taken directly from Stephen Few's book, Information Dashboard Design. Highly recommend it. It's a fascinating read. So there's 13 things here. The ones that I've kind of bolded are the ones that I tend to run into the most. So I'm gonna just go through those ones because I think, yeah, and if I have time, maybe I'll go through some of the other ones as well. The first one, exceeding the boundaries of a single screen. I see this all the time. Like if you're going to design a dashboard, just have it fit neatly on one screen. You want to avoid having the user need to scroll or maybe move to another tab. You want your user to go onto your dashboard page and at a glance see what's there and start like thinking about it. The other one is number 3, displaying excessive detail or precision. So over the years, I've had debates with people, well, what is Cognos BI, or now Cognos Analytics? And is it an ETL tool, or is it a BI tool, like a BI reporting tool? I've seen so many reports over the years where it's literally just this gigantic grid and table of numbers. And I think that there's a time and place for a grid of numbers, but Cognos is not the ideal tool for doing this. It's a reporting tool. And when people look directly at a grid of numbers, it can be useful in some situations, but generally, if you want people to look at information and draw some conclusions or kind of get their analytical mind working, a grid of numbers isn't really helpful. So, and I see this a lot, just too much detail, either too many pure numbers, or maybe in a dashboard reporting on data at too low of a level, like too much granularity. So that's something to avoid. So when you're designing a dashboard, generally, you want to keep things pretty like high level, right? So it's at a glance interpretation of information. And if you want, you can provide your users with maybe drill through reports to view more detailed information. Number 4, expressing measures indirectly. This is something I'm saying less and less of this now, but it used to be really common to see, okay, a dashboard, and then you have, I don't know, like a line graph with 2 lines, one that says revenue, and then one that says operating costs, and the lines are kind of going together, and it looks really cool and awesome. But the problem is, at the end of the day, typically we want to know, well, what's my profit? So when you have the 2 lines like that, it looks cool, it looks like it's providing you with some value, but ultimately you want to know, like, okay, like let's just get to the details, let's just get to the point, like what's my profit? So it makes more sense to simply like calculate the profit and show a single line showing the trend of your profit. So that's an example of like expressing a measure indirectly, because when you show the revenue and the operating expenses separately, your user wants to know the profit, so they're kind of doing mental math. So the whole point of a dashboard is you want to like reduce that kind of mental effort from them. You want them to look at it and be like, oh, that's my profit. The next one, number 6, introducing meaningless variety. I remember back in like 1993, something like that, I played with my first Windows PC, and I was like, fonts, this is amazing. So I got into like Microsoft Write, and then I started like, just like making these really cool, or so I thought, documents with like 100 fonts. And I thought it looked cool at the time, but it's terrible design. It's distracting. It distracts away from the information, and it's just unpleasant to look at. So I think a lot of the tools you're seeing and features you're seeing in Cognos and in a variety of other analytics tools, they have a lot of animations and just kind of cool looking graphics. But I think it's important to always think about like, well, what do I ultimately want to communicate to the person who's looking at this? So focus on that rather than on the like the gee whiz factor, as tempting as it is. And number 10, highlighting important information ineffectively or not at all. So this is something I see less and less of. So I think generally it's something, it's something that is people are generally improving on. But if you have really important information, important KPIs that you want people to like glance at and like know what's going on, make it big, make it front and center. Maybe make it clickable so they can go to another report to explore that particular KPI in more detail. You want to use like the boldness of objects. You want to use, sometimes you can use color, the size of objects to differentiate items that are less important from items that are more important. Okay, so let's go on to, the next one. So these are kind of the rules of thumb that I keep in mind. And again, I got these from Stephen Few. I can't say enough good things about his books and courses. Always think of how much ink you're using. So, now it's of course digital ink, but even if you have like a grid of numbers, do you really need to have lines for absolutely every column and row? Probably not. You could probably get away with your column headers at the top, a dividing line, all of your numbers, another dividing line, and then your summary row. So you've reduced the amount of ink that you're using in that visualization. It's less distraction for your end user who's using this, and it just looks really clean, looks really nice. And you don't feel like when your user's consuming the information, it's not busy. And it's the classic, we've all heard the KISS principle, keep it simple. Simple is generally better, I would say. So if you've designed your dashboard well by doing things like putting profit directly on there rather than revenue and operating expenses requiring your users to do mental math. So if you've done all of those things, you've simplified their experience. And that's also something that I always try and keep in mind when I'm building dashboards. And if a simple bar chart or column chart will do the job of conveying the information you want to communicate, stick with that. You don't need to go with the gee whiz, lots of animation widget. Just keep it simple if that's going to be the best way to communicate the information. And the last thing I was trying to remember is to leave some white space on the dashboard. It's visually pleasing to the eye, and if you use it wisely, it can kind of serve as a little bit of a guide almost to direct your end user's eyes across the dashboard in the way you want. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to just creativity in general, because I think if you're going to be designing dashboards, actually if you're designing anything, creativity is very important to that. So, and also with visualizations, that is something that is a rabbit hole of a topic. It's fascinating, but an hour is not enough to really tackle it properly. So I thought I'd add a little bit of variety to this. So creativity, it's something we're all encouraged to develop in ourselves and to use. But what exactly is it, and why is it so hard to engage it and bring it up to the surface? So the dictionary definition is the use of imagination or original ideas, especially in the production of an artistic work. And I think generally when people think of creativity, they think of the artist, like Michelangelo's making his sculpture. He's painting the top of the Sistine Chapel. But actually, creativity appears in life in all kinds of ways, even in our work in the analytics space. Yeah, we have to come up with creative ways of displaying information, creative system architectures. So we do need to engage with this part of ourselves, even in our line of work. So this is how I define creativity, and I live in Portland, so it's a little bit woo, so I'm sorry about that. I can read it in a woo voice if you like. But so to me, creativity is the state of our mind where we synthesize information into new ideas in nonlinear, non-time-based, non-goal-oriented ways. It's the state of mind that is opposite of the analytical mind that is dominant for most of us as we go through our day-to-day lives. So, I don't know if you can see her. That's our cat Nessa. She's very skittish. And whenever I look at her, she reminds me of creativity. Because if you go up to her to try and pet her, she's just gone. So when you chase her, she runs away, and creativity is like that. But if I just sit there, chill out, she'll come up to me, and before I know it, she's like sitting on my lap, and we're having a good time. So creativity is very much like that. The more you chase it, the more elusive it seems. So some other things to note about creativity is actually related to the Industrial Revolution. And again, this is a fascinating rabbit hole of a topic, so it's just like a Cliff's Notes version. But the Industrial Revolution is what brought us the standardized workday. Now, before labor laws and such, people would work like 12, 17, 36, 48-hour workdays. But now it's become standardized down to a typical 8-hour day. If you go to life before the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot more variety inherent in day-to-day life. So yeah, you might work a little bit, but then you're gonna go feed your chickens, you're gonna go help your friend pick some stuff off his farm, maybe repair your roof. So in the course of day-to-day life, there was a lot more variety, and there was a lot less specialization. So I think the way I would look at it is, today, people say jack of all trades, but master of none, as if that's a bad thing. But before the Industrial Revolution, that was actually common, and that's how people lived. So it's only in our modern age where extreme specialization is kind of the dominant way of living now and working. So the problem with this, though, the standardized workday, is it's not really good for knowledge or creative work. Because I don't know about you, but if I have a difficult problem to solve, if I'm sitting at my desk and I'm working and working, the answer never comes. It just doesn't work that way. And I think this is something that you're starting to see companies in general adapt to this, because they're starting to understand okay, well, it's not like an industrial factory where, yeah, I can just pull this lever for 8 hours a day to punch out widgets, no problem. I mean, that's really boring, and that's a whole other topic, but creative, knowledge work type of things, you can't really put someone on a schedule and say, okay, I want you to have 5 creative ideas by end of business day, go. It just doesn't work that way. And I think creativity is important because over the long term, it's the only way to remain competitive, as automation is going to make complete industries essentially deprecated, right? And we see this happening all the time now. So there's kind of 3 principles and ideas, I think, that can help foster creativity. So one is to create space for it. And I love this quote by one of my favorite authors, Tom Hodgkinson. It takes a lot of organization to be lazy. And it's kind of true. If you actually want to have free time, I think organization is key Like that's really played out in my own life. So if you get organized and you prioritize things in your life like properly, you can get away from this oppressive feeling of like, oh my God, I have so much stuff I need to do and I don't know what to do and I don't know how I'm going to complete it. Because the reality is, it feels like everything you have to do is like high priority and needs to get done now, but it's actually not like that. So if you like kind of plan and organize your life, a little bit more, you can actually approach each day and ultimately just focus on like maybe the 5 or 6 things that absolutely truly do need to get done that day, and not be distracted by everything else. Because we're like constantly getting emails and phone calls. But the reality is we can't multitask. That's not something human beings can really do. So it's a waste of time to try. So it's much better to like pare down what you need to do in a given day to what's actually essential and then work through it in a methodical fashion. So if you do that, you'll reduce your stress, you'll feel calmer, and all of these things feed into creating space for allowing creativity to bubble up. And number 2 is play. Have fun. All work and no play make Jack a dull boy, right? I find if I need to come up with a solution to a problem, it's not going to happen while I'm like sitting at my computer like working. So I'll like close the computer, I'll go for a walk, or I will cook something, or like, I don't know, I'll drive to the coffee shop to get something to drink. And then while I'm driving, it's like, oh, the solution just pops into my head. So rather than taking the kind of analytical approach of like, okay, I have to like work at this for X number of X hours a day to find a solution, if you actually like less is more, like if you just stop, often the solution just comes to you. So I've started to personally like give myself permission to just like have more fun in life, relax a little bit. And I've really found that like the less I do up to a point, the more creativity I have. And I always like to carry either like a notepad to jot down ideas, or if you have your smartphone on you, you can make notes to yourself. Because like if you're out for a walk and you're like, geez, I don't know like how to build that visualization, what should I do? And you're walking and then it just comes to you, write it down right then. Because I find that creative ideas are sort of like dreams. They're very fleeting. So they appear, and if you don't note them down right away, they're gone. This is so true. And this is the third thing, is sleep. And I like to have captioned this here. It might not look like it, but this guy is solving all of the world's problems. And we have an expression, sleep on it. It's an expression because it's true. I've actually been really experimenting with this idea. And if there was a way I could build a strong enough case for it, I think that I should be able to bill clients for the time I'm sleeping, because honestly, that's when the really good stuff happens. I go to bed and then I wake up and it's like, oh, that thing that I was really struggling with for 4 hours today, done. Oh, and you are in good company, as I've noted here. Rene Descartes was famous for sleeping all the time. So apparently he was actually part of like a group of Jesuit priests, and they used to throw cold water on him in the morning to wake him up because he just wouldn't get out of bed. And eventually they made a bit of an exception for him because they were just like, well, nothing we do works. And he would actually like wake up, but then like lie in bed for hours just staring at the ceiling. But that's how he was coming up with all of these things. He was just kind of in this languid, relaxed state, just kind of like, huh. And then all of these ideas are things that he came up with. Okay, so this is something that I'm constantly like in a debate with myself about. Technology and creativity, are they friends or are they foes? And I think technology is great if we use it and engage with it wisely. I do feel, though, that an overuse of technology, or like an automatic reflex to always look to technology for a solution, can over time like weaken your mental faculty that the technology is replacing. So, and I'll go into that a little bit more. There's a really fascinating book by Dr. Norman Doidge called The Brain That Changes Itself. It's all about neuroplasticity, and it's fascinating how the inherently plastic nature of the brain, like its ability to change to conditions and adapt, can actually encourage like creative rigidity or creative flexibility. Like our brains can work themselves into ruts, or they can actually kind of be free and open to new ideas and creating new ideas. So that's a really good book, actually. So I don't know if you can read this, but I drew this by hand because I like drawing things by hand, even though I'm not an artist. But technology use I have on the x-axis. So you have increasing level of technology use. And then on the y-axis, the improvement in creativity and human life. So now this is just my idea. This is not like, double-blind research or anything like that. It's just a concept that, if this is new to you, I just want you to think about and explore. So with technology, I feel like, okay, we get it, we start using it, it improves our lives. Okay, now we're on like the upward side of the bell curve. Cool, so we're gonna like increase our use of technology, and the smiley face guy's there, everything's great. We get to the top, and this is perfect. So the technology is improving our lives. We have, theoretically, more free time, life's more enjoyable. Okay, well, cool. Well, this has been working up to this point. Let's just keep using it more and more. Let's like add more and more different types of technology, and let's just have it do everything. But then unfortunately, in my opinion, I think you start to kind of slip down the other side of the bell curve, because technology can serve you and improve your life, but if you're not careful, it can actually become a negative or a detrimental force in life. So I did a little bit of an experiment with this. I ditched my smartphone. And it's kind of a bit of a joke with my friends. I don't even know where I put it. So this is my phone. I don't know if any of you can see it from back there, but it's not smart, and it's as tough as a rock. I actually have a couple of those, and about a month ago, I live out in Oregon, and I went up to Washington just for the weekend, and I put the phone on the roof of my car and forgot about it. So I drive across the Columbia River, no problems, take a left onto this highway, and I'm driving, everything's cool, and then I hear this like bam, and I look in my rearview mirror and I see my phone like spinning through the air. It hits the asphalt, and then I'm on this road where there's like a cliff down to the river on one side and like a cliff wall on this side. There's no shoulders. So to drive for quite a while and then like pull over in this turnout, and then I had to kind of go like this, like along the edge of the like cliff wall until I got to my phone, only to watch it like, I saw like 3 vehicles run over it with their tires. And then, I picked it up and I dusted it off. It had a couple of gouges. It worked just fine. So, and the battery will last for like a week. But it started about 1.5 years ago for me. I just noticed that my smartphone was always going off, notifications, emails, whatnot. And I was spending a lot of time on it. And I found myself like constantly, like I'd go on to Facebook and then I would just be scrolling, but kind of mindlessly, like, and I had this weird feeling of like, I feel like I'm really busy and I'm doing a lot, but when I objectively stepped back and looked at like what my day-to-day life was like, I actually was kind of just wasting a lot of time really doing nothing. So I also felt that I had like no attention span, And I was starting to feel like my memory start to go. Like I used to be able to remember numbers easily and stuff, and that was just gone. So I decided to give it up, and I thought, okay, cool. I'll try this out for a couple of weeks. It's gonna be fine. Nope. It was painful, and it was complicated, and I didn't realize how much mental work I had offloaded onto my smartphone. So I started navigating without GPS, and that was very awkward and difficult. But I noticed an improvement in my memory and my sense of direction. It took about 2 months. I had lived in Portland for almost 2 years. I still had trouble navigating around the city. So I ditched my smartphone and I started forcing myself to navigate without GPS. In 2 months, I learned how to get around the city without GPS. And I'm almost at a point now where like someone could give me an address and I could roughly approximate where it is without having to like really look it up. Even when I've come to Chicago, if I've been in Los Angeles, I'm able to, within about a day or so, like know my bearings to the point where I can just glance at a map and then just go. And I didn't think this was a big deal, but whenever I talk to my friends about it, they're shocked. They're like, how do you do this? Like I'm some sort of Superman or something. I remember a couple of months ago, I was with a friend of mine in Chicago, and we went out for dinner, and like we parked the car here, and then like walked, over there or something to this restaurant, and we left the restaurant. He couldn't remember where the car was. Like he had to use his phone to navigate back to the car, and I was just like, whoa, what's going on here? And I think it's common knowledge that if you like learn another language, that it generally improves your creativity. I think the same can be said about things like navigating without GPS. It sort of exercises a part of your brain that influences creativity, maybe in a way that's not obvious. But when you offload that work onto a device, because of neuroplasticity, you actually you don't shrink the part of the brain that was maybe responsible for navigating you around, but now the brain's like, oh, I don't need to actually like navigate around myself, so I'm just going to take this like section of brain cells and devote it to something else, because that's how the brain works. So you can always gain skills back, but if you don't use it, you lose it. So these are the things that I like noticed that improved in a time since I've stopped using my smartphone. So my memory has improved so much. I can't even begin to describe how much of an improvement this has made. Because I used to be a reflexive Googler, and it's funny, I was talking to my husband the other day, and he's like, oh, I just Googled something. I'm like, oh, what did you Google? And he said, so you know how like rulers, right? He had to Google how to use a ruler. And I was like, what? And he said, yeah, there's like all those like little markings and stuff on it. So I just didn't know like what those meant. And I was like, well, you can just like count them, right? So if the gradations are really small, you can just count them. And if it's 16, then you know that you're dealing with 16ths of an inch. So, I mean, it's not that, he has like a lack of intelligence. That wasn't the issue. But what's happened is, instead of like thinking about things for ourselves, I think we now have a reflex to just like, okay, I'm going to Google it and look at the answer. But a lot of things, if you just sit for a moment, you can figure it out yourself. And that exercises part of your creativity. So other things I noticed is I have my attention span back. Oh my goodness, like I used to just not be able to pay attention. Like I would be trying to read a book and I just was I couldn't. And it took probably about 6 months. But yeah, now I can just like sit down and read a book. Something I used to do as a child, but it's like I lost the ability to do that. I just couldn't focus for long periods. And I already spoke about my like improvement in my sense of direction. And I feel like I actually have time to do the things that I want to do. And this ties back into getting a little bit more organized. One of my favorite books is by David Allen called Getting Things Done. And since this is a business crowd, I'm sure everyone's heard of this. I think there's a lot of great things in the book. I think it's important to not get like obsessive about implementing a system perfectly. You take a system and you implement it in a way that makes sense for you. And that's personally what I've done, and I'm very happy with it. So now, like, when I get to the end of my to-do list, at the end of the day, I'm like, okay, cool. I don't have to worry about anything else. I can close the laptop and go off and do something else, spend time with friends and family. And I don't have to worry about all this other stuff that has to get done because it's already been scheduled and prioritized, and I just don't have to worry about it. So I went for, actually, when I first switched back to using a basic phone, I actually had my iPhone in airplane mode in one pocket and then that phone in another pocket. And it, like I said, it took a year to fully transition out of it. It really feels like I was weaning myself off of something. Because like I'd leave the house and I'd be so anxious, like, what if I can't look something up? Or what if I can't like look up an address? And I'd have my iPhone there, so I wouldn't be freaking out. But ultimately what I found has worked for me is I did end up getting my iPad, but I don't use the iPad like my smartphone. I don't carry it around all the time. The most I use it is during actually the workday, because it's really good for managing my calendar, which is like full of appointments. It's the iPad Pro, so I actually like being able to like write notes on it. And I don't know if this is a generational thing. Maybe it's going to be different for kids that are growing up now. I find to improve my memory retention, there's no substitute for writing. And I don't know why that is. And I don't know if it's going to be different for the next generation that's coming up, having been immersed in all of this technology. So that remains to be seen. So yeah, that's basically it. We finished a little bit early, but that's okay, because I wanted to see if anyone had any questions, any experiences they wanted to share about anything, visualization, creativity. I'd love to know if any of you do anything to improve your own creativity that you found has worked.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Regarding, you mentioned to indicate important things
Yeah.
on the dashboard.
Uh-huh.
Is there a standard, like, hey, this color represents more important versus,
That,
just like we use stoplight, right? So stoplight is what, like, that
so I think
indicates certain
there might be like a whole chapter in the Stephen Few book about color, because there are sort of like loose standards that we're all kind of aware of, like, okay, red generally means bad or stop, green means go or good. There isn't like a formalized standard that everyone agrees to. I think, with color, it's going to vary from organization to organization. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times people will take a report, and even in this day and age, they will print it. And not all printers are color. So if you use color to represent or show your user really important information, you'll lose that if they print it. So that's something to keep in mind. And I remember when Stephen Few mentioned that, I was like, oh, because I just had not thought about that. But it's so true, because you see people print stuff all the time. So with color, I try and limit its usage and only use it where it's absolutely necessary.
So how would you then indicate something which is more important than the others? Like, what are different ways of doing that? Would you circle it? Would you?
Yeah, so it depends on the information. Sometimes if, like with a bubble chart, for instance, right, size can show important information. But I mean, that's not related to color though. With color, I think that's something you would need to be part of the discussion with your end users, who you're producing a report for, because you need to speak the same language in that way, right? So you need to agree on what different colors mean within your organization. And even after that, I would still suggest if you're going to use color as a key part of your visualizations, you do have to indicate somewhere on there what the different colors mean. Anyone else? Yes.
With regards to design of a dashboard,
Ah,
do you have any rules of thumb that you follow with regards to what you place together? When you talk about different elements.
sure. Rules of thumb on like how to place things together.
Yeah. I mean, thinking of it like a dashboard, obviously what a dashboard is, you've got your speedometer, you got your oil, your gas, and all that.
Sure.
How you're grouping them. Is there a rule of thumb how you...
I would say, yeah, so that's one of the kind of 13 rules is about, what was it? Oh, yeah, showing information in context. So, and I don't think I really discussed this point, but if you're showing like, I don't know, revenue numbers, you might want to show that in the context of historical revenue performance, right? Because the revenue number itself doesn't really tell you anything. It only tells you things like relative to what else you're showing along with it, the overall context. So when it comes to, well, what things should I place together, I would try and refine each of the visualizations that I want to place together, I'm thinking about placing together, as much as possible to really get them nice and simple and very clear. And then if it makes sense to place them together, if they relate to one another, right? And if maybe they provide a context to each other, that's when I would place them together. And the problem is there isn't really like a rule of thumb I can think of because, I mean, there's just so many different types of information. I think you would have to assess it on a case-by-case basis.
Is there like a top to bottom though? I mean, do most users tend to go right to the top left or something like that?
Yeah, well, I would say I think that's funny because that actually is culturally dependent. So I think in Western countries, Western society, yeah, it's top left. People generally start there and kind of, the way they would read a book. But in other cultures, it may be different. So that's another thing about like kind of knowing your audience. But generally, if you have really like, okay, hey, these things are really important, yeah, I would say put them in the top left. Yeah.
I think, sorry.
Yeah.
I think in addition to that, the scrolling feature, like in our company Walgreens, there's Cognos. So the scrolling top to down is relatively easier rather than the right to left. At times people find it cumbersome. So
I would agree with that. Like if you absolutely must have scrolling, then yeah, top to bottom is, I don't know, I find it, to me, it just feels a bit more intuitive. But yeah, there's something funny about like when you have to start to scroll left and right, especially if you have to do both, don't do that.
not everyone has a Mac where it's easier with a gesture.
Yeah.
On Windows, no offense to Windows users, but it's relatively harder. It's getting better, but it's still harder.
Yeah, I think that's why like it's not as flexible a design, but if I'm designing a dashboard like within a corporate environment, I try and specify its pixel size, even though it would be nice to be able to say like 100% like size everything relatively, but in practice I still haven't found that works very well. So I'd say it's best to go with like a pixel perfect, like decide, okay, what resolution is common to, all my users or most of them, and then build a dashboard according to that spec.
Yeah, and in context with the earlier session, the requirements gathering.
Yeah.
So people actually miss out on that piece of the requirement. Scrolling
Yeah.
piece, so that's a very important point. So you have to include the when, how, and all those things which
Yeah.
Mike had alluded to.
Yeah.
Very important, the visual interface, because our brain tends to grasp information much faster visually.
Yeah.
And that's to your point about the handwritten notes and when you draw stuff. So I've seen increasingly in meetings, people are just talking about stuff. It's like as if I'm going to have an interpreter in my brain record the information. Even if you write it, it doesn't, I mean, it's much, slower in terms of interpretation
Yeah.
because of how our brains usually work. It's more of stories and visuals tend to get grasped better.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that could probably be traced back to just our evolution as a species, probably, right? Like why we developed that way.
Right.
So, yes.
Kind of on the same question or topic. When trying to limit a report or a dashboard down to just like one page or as little as possible, I work with like an audience or users that want to continue to dissect down into details and like dissect those details in half and continue to do that until they have to find a root answer. Is there ever a time when you would say like, no, I need to just cut you off from an information flow, or reduce that down, or just set like a limit on that?
So that's actually a tricky question because I think there's sort of two answers to that. I think that if the users are like, well, I want to go down to lower and lower levels, I mean, are they doing that because that's just what they're used to and that's just how they've always done things and maybe it's not actually necessary? If that's the case, then yeah, it might be something to consider to say like, well, it's not necessary to do that in this report. You could also, if they really want to go down to lower and lower levels, maybe that's an opportunity to, in your dashboard, have them click on this, and then it opens up in a new and separate window an analysis object that they can then go down as far as they want. I don't think it's a good idea to have such an analysis object, though, inside of a dashboard, generally. So there's that, and then the other case may be that, maybe they really do need to go down to those numbers and they need to start at the top level and then work their way down. And if that's the case, I still think it's generally going to be best to pop that out into a new window for a couple of reasons. A, it keeps your dashboard nice and clean, but also I think there's going to be some value in, if people are like real analysts, they'll often have like two monitors. Maybe they may want to have the detailed analysis here, but then have the dashboard here to kind of be like, oh, like what's going on here, So.
To follow up on that, so I'm specifically talking about coaches in sports.
Okay.
So I always know my clients will be the exact same.
Okay.
So do you think in some situations it may be better for me if a coach does not connect with the narrative that's going on within a report, having a separate report specifically for that coach? Now this coach links onto this information, and his assistant coach may link onto something completely different, and then creating a different one for each individual person?
I would create separate dashboards in that case. I think it's kind of our natural tendency to want to get as much out of something that we build as possible. But when you try and do a one size fits all, it ends up fitting no one. So we've all had those promotional t-shirts you get at like a trade show, and it's one size fits all. And then some people it's like skin tight, and then other people it's like a moo-moo. So yeah, I try and shy away from doing that with my dashboards. Yes.
Hey, Ruben, just a quick comment on the question a
Sure.
couple questions ago. Just one aspect of it that has helped me a little bit is that sometimes when you're trying to solve for the business problem, you can get like 6 KPIs, but when you start asking, well, what's the business action we're going to take from this? What are you actually going to do with it? Then that might help to condense it down to the 3 KPIs. And that will help to really, get down to the grouping that you really want to get to, initially to see exactly what they can get to.
Yeah, absolutely, and that very much ties into the whole idea of it's so worth it to spend a lot of time designing up front, because that's when you would have these kind of conversations. Because yeah, sometimes I think generally with dashboards, less is more, right? If you have fewer things, but they're actually very useful, your dashboard's going to have a much higher impact, which is at the end of the day what you want, right? So that's much better than just putting a ton of stuff on there just because you have a ton of stuff, right?
So a question for you on evolving reports from rows and columns to better data visualization.
Yep.
And I think in some ways, the rows and columns, that's safe, you know,
Yeah.
no one's gonna complain about that, but then you go to, more complex data visualizations, and it can be polarizing, you know, you can have people who have very emotional and visceral reactions to it, and some people are gonna love it, some people are just gonna say, no, I hate that. How do you change a culture, or navigate a culture?
Yeah.
In going to something like that?
So I think one of the problems that, you know, you'll run into when moving from, you know, straight up numbers view of information into more visualizations is, well, okay, like what visualizations do you pick? Like, do you use like a bar chart? Do you want to use like a line graph? Like, so that's one aspect of the discussion. But I think the only way to really get to the answer of your question is, and this would ideally be part of the design process, is actually talking with the like analysts who are going to be using the information. So you want to talk to the people who are using these number grids and understand what they do with it. Like, what decisions are they making when they look at this grid of numbers? So if you can know what questions they're answering from their grids of numbers, then you can intelligently put together a concept for a visualization that'll quickly answer that question with much less work. But if you just look at a grid of numbers and you're like, oh, well, this visualization makes sense, without actually consulting with that end user, I think that's when you run into this resistance of against visualizations. Because, you know, I may think that this visualization is going to be useful, but I'm not that person. I don't know what they're using the grid of numbers for. So I think designing a dashboard very much has to be, well, it has to be like a bit of a social exercise, right? Like, you have to really find out, like, what are they doing with this information? And then take those answers to help guide you in designing a visualization schema for them. Anyone else? All right. I think that's it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.